This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Do you remember how much your first job paid? For many Americans, their first jobs were minimum wage jobs. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics finds 2.7% of hourly paid workers in 2016 earned the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour or less. Who can really afford to live on those wages? There's a movement in states across the nation, including Connecticut, to raise the minimum wage. Connecticut's progressive Democrats, including Governor Lamont, have been calling for an increase of the state minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2023. Coming up, we'll hear what's driving policy changes in our neighboring states. We'll also hear from small business owners, one who has voluntarily raised the minimum wage at some of her restaurants, and another business owner who's concerned about how a $15 minimum wage will impact his family's business. First, what do economists say about the effect minimum wage has on employees, their employers, and on job growth? You can join our conversation as we ask that question of our next guest. Here's the number, 860-275-7266. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And if you also work a minimum wage job, we want to hear from you. Again, the number, 860-275-7266. Now, joining us from a studio in Charlottesville, Virginia, is Ben Zipperer. He's an economist who studies the minimum wage for the Economic Policy Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank that includes the needs of low- and middle-income workers in economic policy discussions. Ben, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me on.
Connecticut's not the first state to dream this up. There's, as I mentioned, a movement in cities and states around the country, including some of our neighboring states. So we wanted to hear more about what's prompting this broad campaign across the country now, Ben.
Yeah, you're right. There is a broad campaign to increase the minimum wage that has been picking up steam and establishing several new minimum wages in this country at the state level or local level over the last set of years. And what is prompting that is there's kind of the way I think about it is there's kind of two forces. One is this large political movement coming out of what's sometimes called Fight for 15. And this political movement has been very successful in raising awareness about the extremely low wages that we pay certain workers in this country and the need for much higher minimum wages for these low-wage workers. So that's kind of one element, this political push. Then there's also another political element that's related to the fact that we really haven't seen a national minimum wage increase in a long time. The last national minimum wage increase was in 2009, 10 years ago. So the minimum wage nationally has been stuck at $7.25 for about 10 years. And, $7.25, over that time period, because the cost of living has gone up, it's more expensive to pay rent over the last 10 years, more expensive to buy food, healthcare, et cetera. That $7.25 is buying less and less over that time period. So the minimum wage has actually fallen over that time period after you adjust for the cost of living by about 15% or so. So that kind of low level of the minimum wage and that falling real or cost of living adjusted minimum wage and no action on the federal level, along with the Fight for 15 and other political movements raising awareness about low wages, are really what's pushing states and cities and counties to, and now hopefully the nation, to raise the minimum wage.
Ben, I have to admit I was shocked when I realized what the federal minimum wage was. In Connecticut, it was raised to $10 an hour after President Obama started to talk about the importance of raising the minimum wage, I believe back in 2013. But I should also point out that $7.25, that's the federal minimum, but in some states they're making much less.
So most states are required to, for most of the workforce, are required to pay workers what the federal minimum wage is of $7.25 or more if they have a higher minimum wage. But there are classes of workers in our economy that are allowed to be paid much less. For example, tipped workers. So workers who earn tips are not required to be paid an hourly wage of $7.25 an hour. And the national tipped minimum wage for those tipped workers is actually $2.13 an hour, which is obviously substantially less. Now, tips are supposed to make up for that. That's the requirement of the law, but that's very hard to enforce. And so tipped workers are really subject to lower hourly wage standards as a result.
When we think back to the federal minimum wage, like historically, when did it begin, and why did it, for some point in time, adjust for inflation and then became stagnant?
Right. So the federal minimum wage is coming out of kind of the New Deal legislation of the 1930s. So the first national minimum wage was established in 1938, and at that time, I think the minimum wage, if I remember correctly, I think it was, set at about 25 cents an hour. And after you adjust for inflation, that's about, something like $3 to $4 an hour. And then over the next 30 years, until like the 1960s, the minimum wage was raised relatively frequently. And also it was expanded to kind of cover the broader set of workers in the economy. When it was first established, it didn't cover the entire economy. And that those increases and those expansions happened relatively regularly and were sizable, so that by the late 1960s, we had what was the kind of the highest minimum wage this country has experienced. In today's dollars, the minimum wage in 1968 was closer to about $10 an hour. Now, since the 1960s, especially starting in the late 70s and 80s, the minimum wage was increased less frequently, and when it was increased, it wasn't increased that much. And as a result, just like what you were saying, the minimum wage has fallen in value over time. Now, the national minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, which is, something like 29% less than what we paid the lowest wage workers in our economy 50 years ago, which is a really dramatic turnaround. That even though the economy has gotten more productive, even though workers are better educated, they're more productive, we're paying the lowest wage workers today much less, substantially less than we paid them 50 years ago. And that, I think, is one of the most important facts motivating people to be interested in increasing the minimum wage.
You mentioned in recent years a political push to fight for $15 an hour. But when we look at in the 70s, when the minimum wage really wasn't growing, was there a change in the philosophy of lawmakers at the time?
Well, I think there was a very big change in the 1970s and the 1980s, where lawmakers and employers gained a lot of power over setting structure of wages in this economy, and doing so in a way that disadvantaged the lowest wage people in our economy. So kind of around the mid-1970s to late 1970s is when you start to see dramatic changes in that we experience today of inequality taking off, stagnant wages for much of the bottom and middle of America. So a lot of changes around that country that both reduced the frequency of raising minimum wages, but also affected other things in the economy, really started happening around that time period.
You're hearing Ben Zipperer, an economist who studies the minimum wage for the Economic Policy Institute. He's here on Where We Live as we talk about the changes that are driving some states like Connecticut to think about raising the minimum wage, and some of the factors that lead states to maybe push this and wait for the federal government to make a change. You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We especially want to hear from you if you work a minimum wage job job, or if you're an employer and you have concerns about what it would mean if the state of Connecticut would raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour. Again, that number is 860-275-7266. Ben, when we were talking about doing this show, producer Carmen Baskoff was telling me that there are just so many conflicting studies from economists about what the impact is on employers, on employees. Can we talk a little bit about what the research says?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to understand that a lot of the conflict in academic research about the minimum wage is not about actually how large the employment effects of the minimum wage are. It's actually about how small they are. So the minimum wage is one of the most well-studied topics in economics. And if you were to look at this most recent set of studies over the last 15 years or so, what you would find is that, there's studies that say different things about the consequences of the minimum wage. But on average, if you were to take the average study or the typical study, the employment effects of the minimum wage in the average study are actually quite small to non-existent. And in particular, they're very small relative to the sizable, consistent wage gains that low-wage workers are observed to receive after a minimum wage increase. Now, that's true of all studies published in the last 15 years. And in my view, the best studies of the minimum wage actually strengthen that conclusion, that the best studies also show that there are small to no effects on employment of minimum wage increases.
When you think about supply and demand, does that surprise people when they hear what the studies have found?
Yeah, I think it does. And so I think the kind of the concern, the theoretical concern is that, okay, well, we raise the minimum wage, that's going to compel business owners to pay their workers higher wages, and that's expensive, and so they're going to cut back on hiring and hire fewer people, and then there are going to be fewer employment opportunities for low-wage workers, and those low-wage workers that we're trying to help, they're going to suffer as a result. So that's the theoretical concern about negative employment effects of the minimum wage. But I think it's really important that that's only one half of the story of how a real-world labor market works. So it is true that when you raise the minimum wage, employers hire fewer people as a result. It is more expensive to pay for an hour of labor, so you're going to hire fewer workers. That's one half of the story. On the other side, when you raise the minimum wage, it's now easier, because wages are higher, it's now easier to recruit and retain workers. So there are fewer workers leaving their jobs. It's easier to hire workers. And those kind of two forces push against each other. And it happens to be the case in the U.S. economy that those kind of balance out, and there isn't really much of an employment effect at all. So by raising the minimum wage, we actually reduce worker turnover. And that's one way that businesses are able to adjust to higher minimum wages, is that they save on turnover costs, which are actually a pretty sizable component of overall costs for a low-wage business.
You're listening to Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today is Ben Zipperer. He's joining us from a studio in Charlottesville, Virginia. He's an economist who studies the minimum wage for the Economic Policy Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. Now, as we know, there's a current debate in Connecticut to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So after the break, we're going to hear from two local business owners in Connecticut, and we'll take your calls, too. Join us, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Do you think the state of Connecticut should raise its minimum wage to $15 an hour? State Democratic lawmakers and Governor Lamont are calling for an incremental increase over a 4-year period. What's your take? You can join us, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We've been talking about the factors driving this effort in some states across the nation to increase the minimum wage. There have been numerous studies by economists. We've been talking to an economist economist from the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., Ben Zipper, joining us from a studio in Charlottesville, Virginia. We also wanted to hear from business owners in our states. So joining us now by phone is Cheryl McDonald. You know her and her husband's restaurants well, co-owner of Bears Restaurant Group. Cheryl, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
We were interested in talking with you because we know that Bears a couple of years ago made the decision to raise their hourly wage to $15 for non-tipped workers. Tell us about what was going through your mind and your husband's mind when you made that decision.
So we actually had just come back from a trip to looking at equipment in Italy. And, the restaurants there are, non-tipped employees, and people are in the service industry making a good living and making that careers for themselves, and just got us started thinking and talking. And at that point I was working on redeveloping our training program, making it more robust, putting it online, holding employees accountable. And it just kind of went hand in hand with the idea of paying a higher wage with the to give folks an opportunity to support themselves and their families, better than they had been. And, theoretically that there would be that reduced turnover, maybe a higher level skilled employee that would be, looking to come into the restaurant industry.
How many employees are getting at least $15 an hour through your restaurant group, Cheryl?
I'd have to say it's well over half of our employees, so probably looking at about 125 to 150 of the employees.
And what has that been, what's been the financial impact? Because it's not something that you're doing at all of your establishments?
We do it at Bears Smokehouse, at the barbecue restaurant. And it has had it was a decision that Jamie and I made, not in to support the fact that we thought that this is something that other business owners should follow suit with, or that, should be implemented, within the state. This was something that we did personally because of what we wanted to do for our employees. And I would say it's had some effects with turnover, not as much as you would have hoped for, and recruitment. But for the employees that we do have, it has made a difference in their lives personally. It's definitely made a difference. And financially for us, it has a significant impact on our business. So it drives other business decisions. And that's where I would become a little bit hesitant, I guess, to say, watching how something like a incremental increase to a $15 an hour eventually would play and have an effect on business owners.
At the same time, offering the $15 minimum wage before a government mandates it, it does keep your businesses competitive. If this were to pass in the state of Connecticut, would you think it will be harder for you to keep good workers?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that keeping good workers has a lot more to do with the way that you treat your workers when they're at work. So, and the culture that you create. I think for us, we've actually seen better retention as a result of our training programs and empowering our staff and giving them opportunity. So, I wouldn't be hesitant for that reason, no.
And Cheryl, one last question. If the minimum wage does go up to $15 an hour across the state by 2023, do you see that having to raise the wages that you're giving your workers? Over
I'm
15.
Sorry, what was that?
If the rate goes up statewide to 15, would you then find that you'd have to raise your rates a little bit more for your workers to keep competitive?
Possibly. To be honest, I haven't given that too much thought, but what it would do is it would increase for salaried employees and for those upper level employees. Absolutely, that I would say has actually is more of a concern, right? Because as you raise your hourly employees, now you're closing the gap between that and what you're paying your management, and that that's a fine thing to balance.
Well, Cheryl McDonald, again, is co-owner of Bears Restaurant Group. Cheryl, thank you for giving us a call for just a few minutes. Before you go, if lawmakers are listening, what would you advise them as they debate this session?
I would advise them to get out and talk to as many small business owners as possible, and not just small business owners. I think, any business is going to be affected by it, and understand where else would there be an impact for them. It's not just the bottom line of the payroll, but, what other decisions are going to be. If you give to one area, you have to take away from another, and, where are those areas really going to be affected?
Well, thank you again, Cheryl McDonald, co-owner of the Bears Restaurant Group. This is Where We Live as we look at, again, this debate of raising the minimum wage here in the state of Connecticut. We wanted to bring in another business owner to talk about from their perspective. So I want to welcome to the show Brian Jesuron, managing partner of Green Valley Hospitality, which owns and operates 4 restaurants in eastern Connecticut, including the Vanilla Bean Cafe in Pomfret. He and his brother employ about 150 people in their Connecticut restaurants. Brian, welcome to our show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Some of the sentiment that Cheryl communicated, do you share some of that, like some of the concerns for your longtime employees?
Well, one point that she made, and that this is something that my adult full-time employees are concerned about, is that if I have to pay a high school kid $15 an hour to come in and wash dishes, that removes monies that can be going to my high-performing employees that add value and create customers. It takes my ability away to reward them because there's only so much money coming in the door. So folks that I would want to incentivize and have continue to work for me and reward them with raises, that pool of money shrinks. So if I'm paying somebody $17 an hour, now, in fairness, they have to go to 19 or 20 because they have so much more skill. They've been with me for such a long time that the difference between 15 and 17 is just, they're going to look at me and go, what? So it removes my ability to reward my high performers. So I'm calling in from eastern Connecticut, northeastern Connecticut, kind of poor cousin up here in Windham County where, we have the lowest mean income in the state. We average is about $60,000 a year here, whereas Fairfield's over $100,000. So we're a different demographic over here, and my customers can only afford so much. A lot of my customers are elderly retired people who are on modest fixed incomes, and the prices that I'm going to have to charge to support this initiative are going to come as a real shock to them.
Brian, can I ask, and you've been a business owner along with your brother for some time, when Connecticut went, I believe, from $8 in 2009 to $10 an hour, what changes did you have to make in your business?
Well, we, of course, have to raise the prices, and we had to play catch-up because we couldn't do it all at once. We had to spread it out over a couple of years, and it impacted the bottom line significantly. To see a 50% increase in our largest cost, which is labor, over a 4-year period is going to be a shock. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. The state of Connecticut is proposing a number of other initiatives, the paid family leave, all the proposed taxes in the new budget, tolls. That increases all my costs down my supply chain. And I don't fully understand the impact of that, and I won't until it hits us. So all these things are coming at us at once. If even half of this proposed legislation is enacted, we're going to be scrambling to try to make this work. One of the reasons that Vanilla Bean and Dog Lane, now these are fast casuals, so these are non-tipped employees, of which we have about 75 in that category, well, do you have a specific question?
Well, yeah, I do, Brian. So you're talking about, things don't happen in a vacuum. Connecticut is surrounded by other states that are looking to raise their minimum wage to $15 mass by 2023. And I'm just wondering, when you think about trying to get skilled people to stay and continue to work for you, why shouldn't Connecticut attempt to try to remain competitive there?
Well, there's a number of reasons. The state of Connecticut is in much worse shape than our surrounding states. We're essentially bankrupt, and the government is going to be aggressively trying to create revenue any way they can, mainly through taxation and tolls and all these other initiatives. That's all going to happen at once. So in studies on minimum wage, there isn't an adequate amount of information on the impact of 15 being raised so quickly because there hasn't been enough time. Now, the states around us have enacted legislation to get to 15, but it's not there yet. The other concern is what happens when the next recession comes. And we're mandated to keep raising our wage. And a recession is going to come. That's just the economic cycle.
Well, Brian, I wanted to bring in the economist who's with us, joining us from a studio in Charlottesville, Virginia, Ben Zipperer, again, who studies the minimum wage for the Economic Policy Institute. Ben, we've been able to hear from two different business owners in the state of Connecticut. How do you respond to some of their concerns?
I think those are really legitimate concerns. And just picking up at the last point about, how do you raise wages during a recession? And it is very difficult for businesses to raise wages during a recession when consumer demand is low. And that's actually precisely when you want a minimum wage increase to go into effect, because you actually want to, during a recession is precisely the time that you want to make sure that money is in the pockets of very low wage, low income individuals, because they will spend it. They will spend all of it. And that's precisely what you need during a recession. So it's not to say that, raising the minimum wage to any level is easy for a business to accommodate it. But it is something that businesses do accommodate and have been able to do so by the channels of adjustment that all of your guests talk about. Like there's a reduction in turnover, so you're able to save a little bit on turnover, so that helps adjusting to a higher minimum wage standard. And you do raise, as a business owner, you do raise prices after a minimum wage increase. So customers are paying a little more in order for you to afford to pay your workers more.
Now, when we look at, Brian is in the quiet corner, the northeast part of the state. Is there a difference in when you look at when this change is implemented, how it does impact between a rural business versus if you're in Hartford?
Right, that's a great question. So I think that the two things to keep in mind is that, in recent studies that have looked at, areas with kind of lower wages and higher minimum wages, so that the bite or the increase of the minimum wage is even stronger than in, say, like a high cost of living area where wages are already really high, we find that, in those low wage places, the minimum wage does bring about a higher wage increase. But at the same time, there doesn't seem to be any kind of overall employment effect, so that the worry that low-wage workers are going to suffer doesn't seem to really play out in higher or low-wage areas, at least in the kind of minimum wage increases that we've seen in this country over the last 30 to 40 years. The other thing to keep in mind is that even in the lowest cost of living areas of the country, workers are going to need at least $15 an hour in order to make ends meet. At the Economic Policy Institute, we have, where I work, we've constructed what are called family budgets, how much a family in a given area needs in order to pay for basic expenses like housing, healthcare, food, transportation, and so on. And workers all across the country, and in the poorest regions of the country, if you're trying to raise a family, you're going to need at least $15 an hour in order to meet your family budget.
I wanted to take some calls here on Where We Live as we talk about the debate to raise the minimum wage, not just in Connecticut, but in other states. Keith is calling from Preston. Keith, go ahead with your question.
Oh, I didn't really have a question so much as, a comment related to the topic.
Go ahead.
I used to write a lot of business plans when I was in business school and whatnot. But the main catch for me that I would get with a minimum wage or minimum wage increase rather, is that if anything, the the value that's provided from it shouldn't really impact the service-based industry so much, because with a properly written business plan, there's going to be a certain amount of return on investment that's expected from each role or position or whatever service is offered. So there's going to be an hourly return on each position, or expected value that's returned to the customer for it that can be accounted for. But also, if you have an increase in cost for a particular type of labor, it really changes your perception of what you're going to be using that role for, or what you're expecting to get out of it. So you're trying to increase more tasking for it, or expand the responsibilities and roles for it. And also, it offsets a lot of the when you think about a cost-benefit analysis of picking up new equipment or different types of technological opportunities that would provide for that type of service for your business. It really makes those more justifiable. And plus, instead of having a sunk cost in the hourly wages, you're now getting a depreciable asset that will let you benefit during your tax cycle.
Well, Keith, thank you for bringing up some of those points. I wanted to go back to our economists about you had mentioned before we took the caller that $15 an hour would actually help a lot of people. But when you think about how much a person would need to afford a house or to rent an apartment, that hourly wage, is that even greater?
Yeah, I mean, just like you're absolutely right. Just like I mentioned earlier, that workers are going to need at least $15 an hour in every part of the country in order to afford their basic family budget. What I mean by that is that $15 an hour actually isn't enough for many families, especially if you're trying to raise kids. Even if you have two parents working and you're trying to raise a child, there are many areas of the country where it's impossible to make ends meet even with $15 an hour. So $15 an hour, or any given minimum wage that we're talking about, isn't going to solve all problems, but it is going to be a very important boost for workers who are earning exceptionally low wages right now.
Anne's calling from Canton, and we have a couple minutes left. Go ahead.
Hi. My question is related to childcare, particularly childcare provided by students, college students, high school students in the summers. They usually get lower wages, but they're dependents of other people, so they don't need to pay for their own housing, et cetera. If their wages are increased to $15 an hour, then families who don't have a choice but to have childcare, it's not a discretionary solution like going out to a restaurant, their costs are going to go up significantly. And that puts a big burden on working families if we have to pay high school students $15 an hour to provide seasonal childcare.
And
is there any discussion around that?
And that's a good point. I know I have two children myself, and childcare is very expensive. But one question I have, Ben, is when we think about the costs that we're paying for childcare, that money doesn't trickle back down to the worker.
What do you mean?
The hourly wage. I mean, they do the work, but they're not getting paid very much when they think about the type of work they're doing.
That's correct. I mean, we do unfortunately pay childcare workers in many parts of the country, and many types of childcare workers exceptionally low wages. But I don't view that as a problem of the minimum wage. I view that as a problem is that we actually need to raise wages for workers that are taking care of what we value most in society, and that's our children.
And then the other point that Anne was making is, she worries about the impact on working class families who will see their child care costs grow if workers are paid at least $15 an hour. Again, this is something that policymakers need to consider as they're debating whether to raise the minimum wage.
Oh, definitely. I think that the minimum wage is not going to solve, every problem of affordability or even every problem of low wages in the economy. And we have to absolutely complement minimum wage increases with ways to actually provide efficient and high quality care. Maybe that is, for example, subsidies for child care, or expanding access to care in a way that actually brings the cost down through efficient, high quality centers. I think there are a lot of options here, and they should definitely be a complement of minimum wage proposals or any kind of legislation that affects working families.
I want to go back to Brian Jessurun again, one of his restaurants in the state of Connecticut, Vanilla Bean Cafe in Pomfret. Brian, there's a Democratic majority in the General Assembly. Governor Lamont is backing this incremental increase to $15 by 2023. It seems like it's going to happen. As a business owner, over 4 years, is that enough time for you to adjust?
No, I don't believe it is. I believe that the sticker shock to our customer is going to be staggering. And again, we're not in a vacuum here. We're in Connecticut, and all of the challenges that we're faced with here are just going to compound this. Speaking of childcare, a young lady worked for me years ago. She has 16 daycare centers in eastern Connecticut, and I was speaking with her recently. Daycare is a stretch for people as it is, and this is going to raise her costs dramatically. She believes that it will be unaffordable for the average working family in Connecticut to afford her child care. And she believes she'll have to close all of her daycares. She's already closed one. And I would encourage the listeners to speak to, anybody, any small business that they do business with on a regular basis, and ask them how they think this is going to affect them. That's ultimately who pays for this is the consumer. And how much can the consumer bear? And again, rapidly raising a significant cost like this is going to be very difficult for us to deal with. One of the reasons that our restaurants are so popular is because we make almost everything from scratch, and there's a lot of labor that has to go to produce that. So what options do we have?
So, Brian, instead of 4 years, maybe 6 years? Would that be
6 years, we think we could absorb that, and that would go more in line with the rate of inflation. 6 years, we think that would mitigate some of the impact. 4 years, we think, is just too fast. We would have to change our business models, and one of the reasons that we are successful is because of the model. And a lot of models will have to readapt. Look at the grocery industry. Look how quickly they're changing. Somebody sent me a photo just the other day of an automatic floor cleaner that Stop and Shop is using, and the profitability in fast food is very, very low. The profitability in the independent restaurant businesses in America averages between 5% and 6%. And if you start shaving off 2 or 3 percentage points through this, it's debilitating. And the fact is, an entrepreneur needs to have an initiative. And this is going to negate a lot of entrepreneurial incentive because the incentive is being compromised by this.
Well, Brian, we thank you for joining us today to tell us about your perspective as a longtime business owner in the state of Connecticut. Brian Jessurun, managing partner of Green Valley Hospitality, one of the restaurants in eastern Connecticut that he and his brother operate, the Vanilla Bean Cafe in Pomfret. Brian, thank you.
Well, thank you.
I wanted to go back to our economist, Ben Zipperer. We were talking about, again, this push in different states. The city of Seattle is up to $15 an hour. Those studies have been done looking at the impact there. And they've also conflicted, and the economists have changed their original outcome that they said that a lot of these, the $15 wage, when it went up, that there were less jobs, but there were other factors in play, including other things happening in the Seattle economy, less low-wage jobs that are available. So I'm just wondering, as we continue to talk about ways to change this, whether it's in our state or nationwide, what should policymakers be looking at? Should it be pegged to cost of living?
Oh, I think increasing the minimum wage along with the cost of living is an excellent idea, and it's actually something that a lot of places already have started doing. It would be nice if that were happening at the federal or national level so that we wouldn't have this kind of falling value of the minimum wage that we talked about earlier, that as the cost of living goes up, as wages go up, as productivity rises in the economy, that the minimum wage just stays stagnant and falls further behind. But instead, legislation in a number of places, including nationally, but also I think in Connecticut, if I'm correct, is interested in not only raising the minimum wage, but kind of keeping it at that level through automatic, regular, predictable increases in the future by tying, each annual increase to how much inflation went up or how much wages went up over the prior year. So this kind of indexing of the minimum wage is becoming more common and is a way to provide very predictable and regular increases so that both workers and employers are moderately aware of what kind of increases they can expect at the minimum wage.
I think that's a good place to end. We could keep talking about this, but we appreciate your perspective again. Ben Zipperer, an economist who studies the minimum wage for the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Ben, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, what do Connecticut and New Hampshire have in common? They have the lowest hourly minimum wage in our region. We're going to get some perspective from the New England News Collaborative after the break, and you can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, there are a couple of minimum wage bills before the Connecticut General Assembly's Labor Committee this session. And while state lawmakers debate whether to raise the rate to $15 an hour, there's other states in our region, Massachusetts, New York, that have already passed minimum wage laws. To see where they stand, in studio with me now is John Dankosky, editor of the New England News Collaborative and host of Next, a weekly podcast. John, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Lucy.
So you've been looking at the region for some time. Where does Connecticut stand with our neighbors?
Well, Connecticut's sort of right in the middle of things. As a matter of fact, Connecticut was the first to really react to President Obama when he gave a speech in 2014 saying that he wants to raise the minimum wage to $10.10. Connecticut was the first state to say, yes, we're going to do that, but it took them a while to actually implement the wage. They voted for the wage increase in 2014, but then it didn't take effect for another couple years. A few other states jumped past us. Just to quickly go through, Rhode Island right now is at $10.50 an hour at the start of last year. Maine is at $11 an hour, and they're going to be increasing a little bit over time, another dollar next year, and then tied to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which I know something you were talking about over the course of the first part of the show. Vermont, which we'll probably come back to, has everything tied to CPI. They're at $10.78 this year.
That's a strange hourly rate.
It's a strange hourly rate, and it's due to the fact that they wanted to tie to inflation. Massachusetts, of course, in our region is the one that's jumped forward. They're at $12 an hour starting just this year, but over the course of the next few years, they're going to be raising up to $15 an hour starting in January of 2023. So that's a little bit of what's happening across the region. Outside of New England, New York is really interesting because they've got this kind of bifurcated or maybe trifurcated system where there's a rate for New York City that's already in place at $15 an hour, another one for smaller employers in New York City, and the rest of the state is going to slowly ramp up to $15 over time. But that, I think, speaks to the fact that New York is really different than any other state in the nation. It has this, big place, New York City, with very high wages and very high costs, and then a gigantic rest of the state that operates much more like, in some cases, a Vermont or New Hampshire or Connecticut.
I'm wondering how New York City, with what they pay minimum wage workers, how that impacts Stamford or Darien. Do we know?
It's really interesting. It's not entirely clear yet how that works and how that will work over the course of time. What I will say is I haven't heard very much from state lawmakers in Connecticut talking about a system like that for Connecticut, but anybody who looks at the economics of Fairfield County understands that it's one of the highest wage and also highest cost place to live in the entire country. An argument could be made that a living wage in Stamford, Greenwich is a much different thing than a living wage in Pomfret, where we were talking to the business owner earlier in the program, or in Hartford. And I think that's something that Connecticut might need to or want to think about as it's going forward legislatively to sort of jibe with what New York has already done.
I was interested in Massachusetts' policy where they're looking to raise it to over 5 years. In Connecticut, it's 4 years. We heard from the business owner, Brian Jesserin, that says even if Connecticut were to try to do it in 6 years, that would be more palatable for him and his establishments. Yeah,
I think that the plan in Massachusetts to raise it to $15 over 5 years was put into place in large part because there are economic conditions in Massachusetts, specifically in the greater Boston area, that are quite a bit different than in most of Connecticut. Obviously, Greater Boston has seen an economic boom, very high wages, very high job growth. It's the only real place where you're seeing people flow into our region as opposed to flowing out in all the other states. And so the Massachusetts plan to do over 5 years, it seems pretty aggressive, but it's also more in line with the economics, I think, right now of that state.
Your reporters have talked to their governors in their states. What about in Vermont? Like, what has the governor been saying there?
So Vermont's really interesting. As I mentioned, Vermont a couple of years ago passed a minimum wage law that is tied to the CPI, and right now it's at $10.78 an hour. Phil Scott, who is a Republican, and he just served his first term, got reelected for a second term. He vetoed an earlier attempt to raise the wage up to $15 an hour. He was asked about this actually at a candidate forum when he was running for reelection last time, and here's a little bit of what he had to say.
When I was in the Senate, we passed a minimum wage increase. I remember that distinctly. And I remember somebody getting up on the floor and saying, if we pass this minimum wage, if we increase the minimum wage right now with a cost of living increase, we'll never have to have this debate again. Well, here we are. We're having the debate again.
And I think, Lucy, that's a lot of what you might hear from Republican lawmakers in a state like Connecticut. If they say, okay, maybe we don't want to get to $15 an hour, but we want to tie it to a CPI, raise it up to a certain level higher, the argument is we're taking care of it now and we don't have to come back for a long time. But then as soon as maybe Democrats have a little bit more political power, whether it's in the State House in Connecticut or in Montpelier, you end up going back and asking for a higher wage. That's exactly what's likely to happen in Vermont this time around because Democrats made gains in the State House. It's probably likely the $15 an hour minimum wage will come up again, and Governor Scott might not be able to veto it this time.
There's the argument to be made that, we were thinking back to when we first had our minimum wage jobs when I was in high school. But at the same time, should policymakers be doing a better job attracting types of jobs to the state that pay people good living wages where you're not just thinking about the minimum wage worker that's getting $10 an hour?
I think that's been an awful lot of the economic policy argument that's happened around projects like the first 5 that Governor Malloy put into place, or even different states battling to try to attract the Amazon HQ2. When you try to attract jobs that are going to make somewhere around $100,000 a year, or you put a little bit of money at, say, a big hedge fund, as Connecticut has in the past, to attract jobs that are $1 million a year, it's different than attracting more lower wage jobs. But I will note something. The Maine Center for Economic Policy looked pretty closely at what happened in the early days of Maine raising its minimum wage a couple of years back. And again, theirs is going up over the course of time for the next few years. They've said there's not been this decline in the total number of jobs that many people had thought was going to be the outcome. They have not seen people getting the number of hours cut. And they are actually, the Maine Center for Economic Policy is saying it's helped lift about 10,000 Maine children out of poverty because the dollars that are spent at the lower end of the spectrum mean an awful lot more. The differential between somebody who makes $200,000 a year and $250,000 a year doesn't mean the same as the difference between somebody who makes $30,000 a year and $35,000.
We love the work of sociologist Matthew Desmond, which we'll tweet out a link at Where We Live, where he's talking about even the consequences on someone's health when they're able to get a couple more dollars an hour and how that does have ripple effects on their family, their children. Before we go, John, so in Connecticut again, there's a Democratic majority. Governor Lamont is behind this proposal. Is this a done deal?
I don't know that it's a done deal. One thing I've noticed over the course of many years of covering the state legislature and watching politics here is everything needs a certain amount of time to bubble up, as they say, right? A plan gets put forward and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 years down the line, eventually it becomes law. We've been talking about a higher minimum wage for some time, but Connecticut already raised its minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. As we've already heard, many people in the business community are saying this is not the time to impose additional burdens on the business community because we don't want to see them flee. So I think it'll be a little bit more of a battle, perhaps, than some people might think, given the stronger Democratic majority than we've had in the past.
John Dankosky, editor of the New England News Collaborative, also host of the weekly podcast Next. You can check out their great website. We'll tweet it out for all of the collaborative stories about the minimum wage and other things happening in our region. John, thanks so much.
Always good to be here, Lucy.
Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Thanks to our WNPR intern Seth Blair on the phones today. And our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. And if you're going to be down in New London, come visit the Where We Live team. We're going to be there from 11:30 until 1. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening, and check out Washington Street Coffee House in New London.